Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for joining today. The topic of our discussion today would be application of computational fluid dynamics, that is CFD, in the healthcare sector. So, as you all might know, that our healthcare sector has become more and more dependent on the medical device, and device being the center part of it. So, we all are aware that how designing and developing a medical device is something very tedious work and would not be that easy to be done with the simple engineering approach. So, the focus of today's discussion would be on how CFD can help us in developing a medical device in more efficient way, where we could save our resources and do the work in efficient way. Okay, so the agenda we'll be following for this webinar is to understand the traditional design cycle and then compare it with the one which we call it as integration of design cycle with the CAE and CFD. So followed by that, we'll have an overview how the CFD process is, and then I'll showcase some of the case studies we did in past for some of our clients. But okay, before we actually dive in into the design cycle and CFD, so let us try to understand some of the very important design needs that are to be kept in mind while designing the medical device. So, since medical device will play a critical role in modern healthcare, as I mentioned, the industry is now more device centric. So, it would the millions of people's life would be dependent on that. So the design of the devices is then paramount for their safety, effectiveness, but also usability. But then, as I mentioned earlier, designing medical device is a bit of a complex process. So it won't be wrong that if I say medical device design would require a careful balance of not only innovation but then safety through regulatory compliance. So, first and foremost, if we talk about some principles, safety. When I say medical device needs to be safe, because you know, industry has become more and more device centric. So millions of life depends on it, and that is the reason we should create a safe medical device. Therefore, by safety, I doesn't mean that device will not only hamper the life of patients, but then also the environment where exactly it is being used, or by the user could be a healthcare provider. Now, how do we do that? So, to ensure safety of a device, we would require rigorous attention to the details at most of the stages of designing and development process. Next comes the usability. What do we mean by usability is that designing a device that fits the physical characteristics and capabilities of users. So there are a few of the factors to be kept in mind while designing a device for usability. For example, a comfort. Now, by comfort, I mean is that a device can be used comfortably for the people while using it over the extended period of time. And then accessibility. So designing a device for a wide range of users, including those with the disabilities and those like who can easily use it. So these are some of the factors to be kept in mind when we say designing a device for usability. Next comes the reliability. So by designing for reliability, what we mean is that devices are consistent and accurate over the expected lifespan. Why do we need a reliable medical device? Because it is very essential for the patient safety, but also for the efficacy of a treatment. A good reliable medical device would basically create a trust in the healthcare system. So designing a device for reliability comes as an important part. But what could be certain factors we can keep in mind while designing a device to be reliable? For example, we could follow redundancy, fault tolerance process, or derating, using of the derating components. So these are some of the factors to be kept in mind while designing for reliability. Now, the next one comes is serviceability. So by designing for serviceability in medical devices, what I mean is to ensure that the device would be easily maintained, could be repaired, and could be again updated over the period of time. So again, why this is important? Because this helps to extend the device's lifespan, reducing the downtime, and also reducing the cost for users, and again for the company as well. But the next one, the functional needs, is one of the most important one. Why I say that? Because what good is a device if it is not performing the required function it needs to be performed? So designing a device without meeting functional requirement is not good. How do we do that? Basically, we should have a thorough understanding of clinical requirements, user interactions, the environment where we are going to use it, and by integrating all those factors, we can make sure that our device is meeting the functional need. But then, out of all those, we must design the device that basically mitigates the risk while it's using. So this could be ensured by taking a proactive or probably reactive measures to prevent, minimize, or control the impact of the livelihood of or of the risk. But then this is not limited to only such key principles, because there are several others, but these are like key principles to be kept in mind while designing a medical device. Now, why did we discuss this before? Just to get an understanding how our design cycle would play a role in helping design the medical device by adhering to these principles. Now, going ahead, okay, here we shall discuss the design cycles and like then compare it with the one which we have created, or we call it as the integrated one with the CAE and CFD. So, as I mentioned earlier, designing a medical device needs a comprehensive approach. We integrate our user needs, regulatory requirements, technical specifications, and upon that we perform iterative testing. So it's basically a comprehensive approach. Where do we start? We start with the concept development. Here we identify user needs, define the user requirements, brainstorm and create the ideas. After that, we would start with our preliminary design, wherein we would be sketching the initial concepts, or and then once these concepts are finalized, we move ahead for the CAD modeling. So by CAD modeling, what I mean is developing a initial 3D designing with the help of software such as SolidWorks or AutoCAD. But then once we do that, we go ahead, create the detailed models uh, for individual components, assemblies, or even go ahead and do the BOM. So after that, we go ahead and develop a prototype where we could, test the fit form and the function of it, followed by DFM, DFA activities. But then now just go over the first flow chart and imagine if after testing over a prototype, we found out that our product or our device does not meet the specifications or any other user needs which we discussed in the previous slide. So what would happen? This could we have to go and revisit our design approach. We have to redo our CAD modeling. And so this would be a rigorous process, non-ending process unless we develop a better product. So here, our approach, the one we on the right hand side, you can see the flow chart comes in play, and the CFD or CAE simulations could come and rescue us. If you see on the right hand side, we start with the CAD modeling, but then we also add one more step, that is the CAE and the CFD. So here we already have a CAD model. We import that CAD model into the CFD software. We do pre-processing, put boundary conditions, real life situations, boundary conditions, and then we go ahead and solve the results. Once the results are out, we analyze it, we evaluate our design, do the post-processing, and then go ahead if the functions are met for the prototyping. So what happens exactly is we already have a fault-proof device, a better version of a device which has less likely chance of failing. So this would save us from redoing the prototyping task, and not only that, saving our resources, time, also the cost to the company. Okay, so how our design process would look like for medical devices when we integrate our CAE or CFD into it? We basically would start with design needs. So once we have the design needs, we would go ahead, write the specifications, write the product requirements, and then start with the collecting relevant informations for our feasibility studies. Once that, we would go ahead, create our design conceptualizations, start the CAD modeling, and once we have the CAD model, we go ahead, do the simulations by adding proper doing proper meshing, adding proper boundary conditions, and then analyzing it. Once we get the results, we analyze the results, optimize our design, evaluate that, and then once we feel that our that the design suffice or meets our functional requirement, we go ahead, do the documentation, probably creating a 2D drawing and other documentation part of it. Further, then start with the process planning, production planning, actual production, quality control, packaging, handling, marketing, and other things. So this is how the overall design process would look like once we integrate our CAE or CFD into it. Okay, so now before we go ahead with our presentation, I would like to take a small poll. With this, I would understand about the level of familiarity you have. So what you will be seeing on the screen is a poll where you have three options. Probably you can select the appropriate one amongst those three. We would have 30 seconds of time for that. So I request everybody to please go ahead and select the appropriate option. The poll starts now. Okay, so I see most of us have already selected the option. So going back to our presentation, I see that many of our participants are having a bit understanding of the CFD simulation. So, it will give us a good opportunity for us to review uh, in the coming slides for the simulation. Going ahead, we'll start with the understanding of the CFD. I don't want to create it as a much detailed presentation like a classroom one, but then it will give some insight on the CFD and also like highlight about our capabilities for the CFD. When I mean CFD is computational fluid dynamics, so it is a science of predicting fluid flow, heat transfer, mass transfer, chemical reactions, or related phenomena. This could be done by solving a mathematical equations which govern these processes using various numerical techniques. The governing equations are mostly based on conservation of mass, momentum, energy, or etc. So why do we need a CFD simulation? Because with the CFD simulation, we can enhance our design, we can improve the overall performance of it, and there are several past examples where it has been done. For example, we did the ventilation design dialysis machines or other medical equipments too. But not only that, like through the CFD simulation, we can also examine the thermal performance of the medical device. But not only that thermal performance, but then we can also evaluate the acoustic performance, such as you can see the noise levels or the sound pressure levels it has been created. But how exactly the CFD simulation would come handy? So you can use the CFD results for your conceptual design studies, detailed product development, troubleshooting, or even for the redesigning of your equipment. Let us see some of the advantages of medical CFD. So, CFD simulation may be used in several ways in healthcare or biomedical engineering sectors. For example, we may use this to model a flow of blood through the cardiovascular system, or even to identify the blockages in the lungs, for example, COPD. Moreover, CFD can also be used to mimic the flows of the fluid through medical devices such as dialysis ventilators, pyrometers, many more. But then, why should we use the CFD simulation? is because it is considered as an alternate to the experimental study. And we all know like how expensive and how time consuming uh, the experimental study would be. And not only that, like when we are creating a complex medical devices, so the CFD simulation could come handy for us. So that is the reason we say we can create a safe product, because we already know the what are the risks associated, and we can minimize those by doing a virtual simulation. So the end product what we will get will have a less fault or a better product, so the product would be safe. And the time required for it to go to the market, the turnaround time would be much less, because we may not be involved in doing a lot of prototyping. So and also like since till the time we go to the prototyping phase of it, we would already have a better product. So it's a kind of first time right approach we are following here. And the cost which is required for developing a product would be much less, because ultimately the prototyping, lot many prototyping part of the process would be reduced, and we can already have a better product till the time we reach that phase. Basically it will improve our decision making, because we can simulate a number of ideas into the CFD simulation. So our decision making for a better design would be improvised. And we could be doing this in very less amount of time, since there's no need to go ahead create a physical prototype of it. We can only just have a design, put it in the software, simulate it with the real life conditions, and then also with the help of the better computing, we can do it even better, even faster. So the turnaround time reduces. The most added feature of CFD would be that we can simulate the real life conditions into it, or even the ideal conditions into it, so that this gives us more flexibility. So yeah, these are all some of the advantages we having with the CFD simulations. But then how CFD process overall looks like? We already know the problem, and we have a model, we have a problem statement, and once we have the problem statement, we'll go ahead create a goal for it. So it could be anything. Probably we want to design create a device for better thermal performance, or we want to create a device with a better flow. So we once we decide the problem, we problems and goals, we start ahead with the modeling. So the initial step of modeling is that selecting a geometry. Once we already have a geometry, we would clean it, suppress the unwanted parameters, which probably may not affect the CFD simulations. And then once we have a better geometry, we would select the domain, the appropriate domain which is required for simulation. Because in the computer it is an endless space, and we want to confine our simulation to a particular part of it. So that is where the domain comes in play. After that, we would go ahead, select the physics of it. Do we want to do we want to simulate for the heat transfer, or do we want to create a compressible flow? What type of flow properties would be used? What type of flow would be used? Viscous, in viscous, what are the boundary conditions to be used? Where would be the inlet, outlet? What would be heat adding components? Once we model that in the boundary conditions, then we go ahead and do the meshing. So why meshing is important? Because as I said, it is the process where we would be calculating with the help of numerical solutions. So all these numerical techniques would not be applicable to the entire surface. We may have to break down that surface into various parts. So that is done basically with the help of meshing. And there could be two type of meshing, unstructured or structured meshing. So we can select what type of meshing do we want based on the complexity of it. So once we have the meshing, we'll further import that model to the solver, and then solver would some settings would be done in the solver. For example, what iteration steps we want, what type of precision level we want, single digit or double precision we want. We want to have a steady or transient flow, what type of numerical schemes we want. And this, by selecting all those into the solver settings, so we would be then finally ready for our simulation. We'll then further go ahead, solve the problem. Once we get the results would only make sense if we create a proper report of it. So how do we exactly create a report? That particularly depends on solver to solver and then project to project. But then we can use the help of contours, streamlines, pressure plots, and then it will make sense where exactly do we want to improve or how the results are helping us out with the better design approach. But then out of all this, the next thing comes the verification and validation part of it, because when like it's a computational simulation, it will give us input, it will give us the output the way we input our results or input our conditions into it. So it's better to verify it, validate those results. It will help us to gain the confidence in our simulation. So this is how the overall process for CFD simulation looks like. Okay, now let's try to go in a bit of details of modeling. So we may start modeling by geometry selections. Majorly, we have CAD models as our starting point, but then this need not to be the case every time, because we can also input coordinates of point, a blueprint. But then CAD modeling comes with various added advantage of it. Why I say that? Because CAD modeling will have various information available in the ready form. For example, but then still, let's take an it will still come with some of the issues. So let's take an example for issues which will have through the CAD modeling. Maybe it will have much more needed information once we input that CAD model into our CFD software. So then this extra features would have to be suppressed, because the more the complexity, the more the time it would be taken for a solution to be solved. So some of the features which are actually not needed, but and also it will not hamper the results of our safety simulation, needs to be suppressed. And once we suppress that, but still like in majority of the cases for the CAD softwares, they are solid modelers. So the surface which we output from them, or the quilt, will still have some of the trim surfaces or have gaps in the edges that needs to be closed. And the other aspect of CAD modeling is that the design engineers will always keep in mind the tolerances, fits, clearances that are to be added. But with this information may not be needed at this point of time. So this is an added information. Though CFD analysis, CFD analyst would have to go back, clear the geometry, see if there is any open gaps or any edges into it. The extra features needs to be suppressed, and this is what we call it as a pre-processing or geometry cleanup. This is the first step of the modeling. But then, as I said, geometry detailing has to be reasonable, because the more the complexity, the more the time taken, and probably will not add that advantage to our results. So suppressing the geometry would play an equally important part. But then once there's an approach we CFD engineers use, that is called as a sequential approach. Why do we use that? Is because if we have a too complex product, and that product, rather than going ahead directly with the whole complexity, we would further take a simple geometry and keep on adding the complexity to it till the time we reach the better results, and CFD analysis would be performed in very much a better way. So next comes, we already have our geometry, we have cleaned up our geometry. Now we have to decide where exactly do we want to confine our simulation. So we call it as a flow domain. To understand what flow domain is, we may call it as a portion of a space where solution of a CFD simulation would be performed. And how this would be performed, because the computational domain will then further discretized into computational grid, mesh, we can call it as a mesh, or so that to solve the discretized equation of the fluid flow. Now let's take an example of the external and an internal flow. So consider the external aerodynamics, where the CFD simulation of a flow would be performed. So the flow would be over the body, right? And the geometry would, or the domain would be then around the geometry, probably the geometry of interest. Now, if we consider the internal flow, here the computational domain is then further defined by the confines of the geometry itself, and the space inside the geometry would be discretized into computational grids, and that's how will the meshing would be done. So just to summarize, a flow domain basically defines a closed volume. Now, domain will need not too complex. Designing a flow domain will not be a complex approach. It would be done simply by just sketching out the topology of the grid, and once that is done, the length of flow domain may vary based on that grid structure or the type of grid we are using. So if we take an example of the structured grid, so the domain needed would be much more longer than the unstructured grid. Now, if we talk about the geometry, this is the geometry will be a part of a flow domain boundary, which would be required for creating the boundary layer. And so, yeah, this is all about the domain. And but then once we already define a domain, we would then further dividing that domain into the grids and cells. The cell is basically the smallest finite control volume. Going ahead, so how do we generate a mesh? Basically, to generate a mesh, we would have a geometry and a flow domain, which are then inputted into the grid or mesh generator, and that's how the mesh would be generated. How the grid? So basically, grid would be categorized into classified into two parts: the structured and the unstructured one. If we talk about a structured grid, basically it will use topology in which the cells are arranged in the array structure, and the location of neighboring cells would be implicit in the array indices of I, j, and k. Compared to that, if you talk about the unstructured grid, it will have no inherent ordering of the cells, and so the arrangement would be specified explicitly. The unstructured grid will allow more flexibility, but then it will come at the expense of storage. So, but then there is one more way you can, or the type of a grid, that is a hybrid grid. Now, this would depend on how complex your model is. So we can, where the complexity is more, we can go ahead with the unstructured grid, and where it is very simple, we can go and do the structured grid. So to summarize on the grid, grid is always body fitted, and it will follow the shape of body, where the grid points or vertices are arranged in array structure with the indices of I, j, and k. Generally, the I coordinate would be streamwise. Grid points would be clustered to provide the resolution of the flow gradient. A structured grid can only have the finite volume cells with the hexagonal shape, but then the unstructured grid comes with much more possibilities. We can have the cells of pyramidal cell, a prismatic cell, a tetrahedral cell, or a generalized cell in that case. So those are the differences between the structured and the unstructured grids, and how exactly we do meshing. Once we have the meshing, we go ahead, import our model into the solver. So here, as you know, CFD is basically the art for replacing the differential equations that would be governing the fluid flow with this set of algebraic equations, PDEs, which in turn can solve with the head of computers. So there are like three methods a solver would follow. That is finite difference method, finite element method, and finite volume method. Let's talk about the finite elements. Let's discuss about the differences between them. So if you compare all those three with respect to the mathematical formulation, then FEM formulates the problem by discretizing the domain into finite elements, and then it approximates the solution using some polynomial functions over these elements. The FVM, that is volume method, would discretize the domain in kind of regular grids, where it would replace the derivatives with some finite with some approximations, and then solving it by integrating the governing equations onto these volumes. If you consider the conservative laws, so FEM is inherently conservative, and basically it will integrate the governing equations over the control volume, ensuring the conservation. FVM would conserve mass, momentum, and energy due to its variational formulation, and FDM can directly handle the conservation's law by discretizing the derivatives in the governing equations. If you take the case of meshing, so FVM can handle both the structured and unstructured mesh, probably the most flexible one amongst all the three. But then FDM, it would be typically using a structured mesh, and FVM would be using unstructured mesh as well. So the most, if we take an example of the most famous solver, or let's say the most used solver, that is Fluent, is typical example of finite volume method. So once we now decided the solvers, we go ahead do the solver settings, and to do that, basically we would select like what type of flow we want. For example, we want an internal flow or an external flow. Do we want a viscous or inviscous fluid? Do we want laminar or turbulent flow? Compressible, incompressible? Do we want to perform a single phase simulation or a multi-phase simulations? And whether we want to add surface tension or we want to go ahead with the free surface flow. So these kind of physics has to be, or the settings has to be done on these solvers. Once we do that, we then add the boundary conditions to it. By boundary conditions, what I mean is the inlet and outlet boundary conditions, or even heat adding elements, whether it is a surface element or the solid element, solid heat adding elements. So those has to be selected. And once we add our boundary conditions, we go ahead, solve our problem. But then before even solving that, there are like certain assumptions are required, because there are too many variables into it, and having an assumptions would basically manage the complexity level while even preserving the important features of the problem. So assumptions play a major role. Once we have these assumptions, we go ahead, do the solving, and once we solve that, we'll go ahead with the post-processing, create a reports to make a sense of what CFD simulation is. But then, as I was mentioning earlier, there's a need to perform the verification and validation of the CFD simulation, because it's the way we give the input, we'll get the output similar way. So verification, validation, why do we need it? Because it will increase our confidence in the simulation. As you all know, like there's literally no software that have zero errors. So if you say verification could be done by choosing the right equations and then doing a POC, proof of concepts. Numerical techniques for verification could involve like finding out source of errors in spatial and temporal discretization, or rounding off errors, or iterative convergence in that case, if you call. So now then comes the time where we would check our time steps as well, whether those time steps are adequate for our simulation. So this is also a part of verification, we can call it. When we say validation, it is basically solving the right equation. So is the simulation matching with the experimental data? And the experimental data basically will help to validate similar kind of simulations. And then we could also use some of our scientific literatures before we start with the simulation. So verification and validation has to be done to increase the confidence in the simulations. So yeah, we all know that CFD is now a very powerful tool and would help to solve most of the complex flows in the engineering systems. But however, we should take an extreme care, for generating geometry, selecting of grades, choosing what type of flow model, what type of boundary conditions to be added, then what material properties to be chosen, what or for that case, convergence criteria, what convergence criteria we want to use. So taking care of all those things, we can get better results, which would help us to design and develop a better product. Already a good product before we reach the prototyping stage, fault-free product we call it. Okay, so next I want to showcase some of the case studies which we did in past. So let's go to the first case study here. We performed a CFD simulation on the lumen of a diagnostic catheter. So a diagnostic catheter is basically used to capture a critical cardiac information, and this is done basically through the electrodes which it will have, followed by some irrigation holes from where a saline or a fluid solution would be coming out. This is required because to suppress the coagulation and get a better picture from those electrodes. So we already had a problem statement that there were 10 irrigation holes and we wanted to have a equal volumetric flow through it. So what we did, we performed a CFD simulation through it, but then we used iterative simulation with the sequential approach. As I was mentioning earlier, we added a complexity to it step by step and performed an iterative simulation with keeping the diameter of the lumens as our focus point. So the boundary conditions here were like we already had very less flow volume rate, that is 4 ml per meter per minute, and that to a long geometry, but very minuscule diameters. So we performed iterative simulation first without the risers, and we were able to achieve the variation which is even less than 2%. So that was a huge success, and then we then further followed that with by adding more complexity, that is the adding risers into it, and we were able to deliver the results which were in the variations of less than 10%. So yeah, that's how we developed that, helped CFD helped in developing that product, and the product is there in the market now. The next case study I want to talk about is HbA1c diagnostic machine. So here, our problem statement was to design and develop the heater plate, which would be surrounding the cartridge where we would have a blood, and we wanted to do a set or maintain a set temperature that is of 35 degrees Celsius, because only at that temperature the analysis could be done. So to do that, what we did, we performed two simulations. First, we went ahead with the steady state simulation for the components, not considering the whole system. But then, followed by that, we performed a transient state simulation for complete system. It was a system level simulation. But then, with the first simulation, steady state simulation, we were able to optimize our heater plate. We would locate what exactly are the heating spots and where the localized heating is happening. So we reduced that material from that, and then that's how we achieved uniform heat distribution. Once that was done, we went ahead with performing the transient simulation over the complete system, where we were able to choose an optimal CFM. But then once we chose a CFM, there was some turbulence issues happened. So we gave the suggestion of adding vents to the enclosure, and that's how we successfully then make sure that 35 degrees Celsius was maintained into the enclosure by designing and developing the heater plate and also modifying the enclosure. That too, Celsius. So this was a successful simulation we performed, and the product is still there in the market. Going on, the last case study. So here we performed a simulation on the ultrasound-based tissue cutting device. This device basically are used to cut and seal the tissue, minimizing the blood loss. This was a feasibility study on the concept. As I was mentioning, your CFD simulation could come handy even for the concepts, and we already have a better concept till the time we approach our actual prototyping phase. So here what we did, we performed a thermal analysis, again used the iterative approach here, and with the simulation we were able to identify that there was a localized heating at the arm tip, and because of that the concept actually failed. So we went ahead, told them some suggestions, give them some suggestions, and with our suggestions and changes in the design, we were able to then create a better concept, which again then went ahead for the production. So these are some of the case studies performed where we were able to develop an effective design by not only saving cost and time, but also a very efficient way we could do that. So yeah, that comes to the end. So this is all for today, and I hope you like the content which I delivered today, and I was able to give you some insights on the CFD methods and thermal analysis. But then what Decos could do, we would be happy to help you with any of your product designs, development, prototyping, optimization, troubleshooting, because we use cutting edge techniques and tools for our work. Before we end, please note that this is a recorded version, and this webinar would be available on our website for at least a week. The link to that would be sent to you over your registered email, where you can access this webinar. And also, we were not able to take the question and answers because of the limitations of time. So if you have any doubts or any questions, you can please reach out to us, and we would be coming back to you with the answers. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you so much for joining.